Somewhere in northern Arizona, on a stretch of sandstone above the Painted Desert, there is a line carved into rock. It runs straight for a while, and then it splits into two. One path continues on, unbroken. The other breaks apart into fragments, drifting off the main line like debris. Figures walk toward the place where the paths divide, and above the split, carved into the same stone, sits a circle. In Hopi tradition, that circle is a star. Nobody living today can tell you with scientific certainty exactly when that carving was made. Nobody can tell you with total precision what every image on that rock means, either. Not because the knowledge doesn't exist, but because the people who hold it have spent generations deciding deliberately how much of it belongs to the outside world. In the winter of 1958, a writer named Frank Waters travelled into Hopi country and sat down with a group of elders in the village of Ovryby. He kept coming back, not for a week, not for a single interview, for years, working alongside a Hopi translator and artist named Oswald White Bear Fredericks. Waters recorded testimony that very few outsiders had ever been permitted to hear in that kind of depth. What came out of those conversations became, and remains, one of the most detailed non-Hopi accounts of Hopi cosmology ever published. Buried inside that testimony is a prophecy. The elders described a star, not yet visible in the sky at the time they spoke, that would one day appear. When it did, they said, it would mark the final stage of a much longer sequence, a passage they called the time of purification, the last stretch of road before what Hopi tradition calls the emergence into the fifth world. This video is not going to tell you that a secret government file is sitting somewhere unopened, proving the prophecy true. That's not what the evidence shows, and pretending otherwise disrespects both the science and the Hopi people, whose tradition this actually belongs to. What we're going to do instead is slower, and honestly more interesting. Separate exactly what is documented from what is speculation. Look at a real supernova that lit up the daytime sky nearly 1,000 years ago, and understand why the two threads, the prophecy and the physics, have never been formally placed in the same room, not because someone is hiding something, because of how knowledge, science, and cultural protection actually work. To understand the blue star, you first have to understand the frame it sits inside, because in isolation, a single prophecy about a star sounds like folklore. Inside its actual context, it's one note in a much longer piece of music. Hopi cosmology, as recorded in multiple ethnographic sources over more than a century, describes a sequence of worlds. Humanity in this telling has already passed through 3 prior worlds. Each one ended because people, not gods, people strayed from a right way of living, greed, corruption, forgetting the instructions they'd been given for how to live in balance. Each ending was catastrophic, and each time, a small number of people who kept faith with the original instructions were guided into the next world to begin again. We are now, according to this tradition, in the 4th world, and the movement toward a 5th world is preceded by a recognizable sequence of signs, collectively described as the period of purification, wars reaching every corner of the earth, the erosion of respect between people and land, technologies that outpace wisdom, and a slow unravelling of tradition itself. In the version Waters recorded, a blue star, not visible in the sky at the time the prophecy was given, is described as one of the final markers in that sequence, arriving late, not early, as a signal that a point of no return had been reached. It's worth pausing here because this is exactly the point where a lot of online content goes wrong. This isn't some obscure detail invented for internet mystery content. Prophetic tradition and a cyclical view of world ages are a documented, serious, and openly acknowledged part of Hopi religious life. Hopi cultural authorities, including the tribe's own Cultural Preservation Office, have spoken publicly about elements of this worldview for decades, most famously through the Hopi spiritual leader Thomas Banyatsia, who was formally designated by Hopi traditional leaders to carry certain prophetic messages to the outside world, including in an address to the United Nations in 1992. That's a real documented, on-the-record event, not a rumour. What's contested isn't whether Hopi prophetic tradition exists. It's how much of it outsiders were ever meant to receive, how faithfully specific written versions like Waters's reflect what elders actually said versus how Waters chose to frame it, and what kind of claims, if any, can be responsibly made connecting that tradition to specific historical or astronomical events. Frank Waters was not Hopi. He wasn't a professionally trained anthropologist either. Born in 1902 in Colorado, of partial Cheyenne descent, Waters spent much of his life in the American Southwest and had lived for periods among Navajo and Ute communities before turning his attention to Hopi tradition. By the time he began the research that became Book of the Hopi, he was already an established novelist, best known at that point for The Man Who Killed the Deer, working with Oswald White Bear Fredericks, a Hopi artist, translator and cultural go-between who is credited on the book as recording the drawings and much of the source material. Waters conducted interviews with roughly 30 elders, most of them associated with the village of Oribe, over a span of years rather than a single visit. The finished manuscript, Book of the Hopi, was published by Viking Press in 1963, running to nearly 350 pages with dozens of illustrations. For its time, the book really was unusual. Oral tradition of that depth, creation narratives, migration stories, ceremonial structure, historical memory of contact with Spanish and later American authorities, had rarely been assembled into a single English-language volume with this level of detail. Some reviewers, including some within professional anthropology, praised it precisely for that reason. A rare, patiently gathered record of testimony almost never shared with outsiders at that scale. But the book also drew real, substantive criticism, and it's important to be honest about what that criticism actually was, because it's more mundane and more credible than the establishment didn't want this to be true. The core problem reviewers raised was methodological. Waters was a novelist, not a field ethnographer trained in documentation standards. His own literary voice, interpretation, and narrative shaping run through the text alongside the elders' testimony, and there's no clean, marked boundary telling a later reader exactly where verified oral tradition ends and Waters' own authorial framing begins. That's not a scandal. It's simply a limitation baked into how the book was written, and it's the same limitation that makes the book harder for later researchers, Hopi or otherwise, to treat as a clean primary source rather than a hybrid of testimony and literature. The Blue Star passage lives inside that hybrid text. It is real, it is published, and has been in print continuously for over 60 years, but by its very nature, it isn't the kind of claim outside researchers can independently verify against some older, separate written record, because Hopi tradition was, and to a significant degree still is, transmitted orally, clan to clan, generation to generation, not archived like a court document the way, for instance, Chinese imperial astronomical records were. About 40 miles from where those 1958 conversations took place stands a sandstone formation known today as Prophecy Rock, near the village of Old Oribe. Old Oribe is itself historically significant on its own terms, widely described as one of the longest continuously inhabited settlements in North America, with occupations stretching back roughly 1,000 years, predating the arrival of Spanish colonizers in the region by centuries. Carved into the rock face is the image described at the top of this video. A long horizontal line representing a path splitting into two roads, with human figures walking toward the point of division, and a circle, identified in Hopi tradition as a star, positioned above the split. Additional figures and symbols appear alongside it, interpreted within Hopi tradition as representing the choices facing humanity during the purification period. Here is the honest, complete state of the physical evidence. The petroglyph is real. It has been photographed, sketched, and described by outside visitors for well over a century, and its imagery is broadly consistent with the purification narrative recorded by Waters and others. What it does not have is a peer-reviewed dating study. Archaeologists do have tools for estimating the age of rock art, most commonly by analysing rock varnish, the dark mineral patina that slowly accumulates on exposed stone surfaces over centuries. But varnish dating is notoriously imprecise as a standalone method. It can suggest relative age and rough ranges, not a confident calendar date, and it becomes far more reliable when paired with other dating techniques or direct archaeological context which hasn't been formally applied here. So the honest answer is, the carving clearly predates the first written outside descriptions of it, going back into the 19th century at least. Beyond that, nobody outside the Hopi community can currently say with scientific confidence exactly how old it is. That is a real and openly acknowledged gap in the record, but the reason it's a gap isn't mysterious or sinister. Partly, it's a simple matter of priorities and funding. No research institution has made Prophecy Rock a priority for a formal dating campaign, and partly, significantly, it's because the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office has maintained a consistent decades-long entirely public position that certain knowledge is meant to be shared on Hopi terms, in Hopi context, not extracted, tested, and handed back stripped of the meaning that made it sacred in the first place. That is a stated policy, not a silence to be read as evidence of something hidden. That policy deserves real context, because it didn't come from nowhere. Hopi communities, like many indigenous nations in North America, lived through federal boarding school policies specifically designed to break the oral transmission systems that carry knowledge like this forward. Children removed from families, punished for speaking their own language, cut off from the clan and ceremonial structures through which this tradition is normally passed down. Ceremonies were suppressed for periods under federal and missionary pressure. Sacred and ceremonial objects were removed into museum and private collections, catalogued as artifacts, often with little or no regard for the meaning or protocols attached to them by the communities that made them, a pattern well documented across indigenous North America, and part of the reason federal legislation like the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act exists at all. Given that history, a cautious protective posture towards sacred material isn't a locked door hiding a secret. It's exactly the response you'd expect from a community that has directly experienced what happens when its knowledge leaves its hands without protective context attached. Beyond Prophecy Rock, it's worth noting that the blue star isn't presented, even within the tradition itself, as an isolated or freestanding image. It sits inside a longer described sequence of signs, other markers of the purification period referenced in Hopi oral tradition and in Waters' text, of which the star is described as the final one, arriving after the others rather than as a first warning. That structure matters for how the prophecy should be read. It isn't framed as an isolated prediction to be checked off a list, but as the closing note of a much longer narrative about how a people conducts itself over time. To understand why this prophecy sits inside a genuinely credible tradition of sky watching, rather than pure folklore invented after the fact, it helps to look at what is not disputed at all, what's published, peer-reviewed and accepted without controversy in mainstream archaeology. Chaco Canyon, in what is now northwestern New Mexico, is one of the most studied archaeological landscapes in North America. Between roughly the 9th and 12th centuries, ancestral Puebloan communities, the historical ancestors, by their own oral tradition and by broad archaeological consensus, of several present-day Pueblo peoples, the Hopi among them, built a complex of large multi-story structures known as great houses. Multiple studies, published in peer-reviewed archaeological journals, have documented that walls, doorways and interior chambers within these structures align with solar and lunar cycles, including the sun's position at the solstices. Producing alignments of that precision and maintaining them across construction phases that in some cases spanned generations, required sustained, careful observation of the sky over long stretches of time, not a one-off guess. The most famous single piece of evidence for this is the so-called sun dagger on Fajada Butte within Chaco Canyon, discovered and documented starting in 1977 by independent researcher Anna Sofer. The site consists of two large sandstone slabs positioned in front of a spiral petroglyph carved into the rock behind them. As the sun moves through the day and through the year, the gap between the slabs channels sunlight into narrow daggers of light that cross the spiral in specific, repeatable patterns at the summer and winter solstices and at the equinoxes. It's a striking, elegant, low-technology solar calendar, carved by people with no written astronomical tables, achieved purely through patient, repeated observation passed down with enough fidelity to be engineered into stone. It's important to add a detail that often gets left out of more sensational retellings. The sun dagger site itself was closed to public access in the 1990s, after researchers determined that increased foot traffic around the slabs had subtly shifted their position, altering the very light effect that had made the site significant in the first place. That detail matters because it's a useful reminder that even the most solid, hard evidence archaeoastronomical sites are physically fragile and easy to disturb. A small, human, practical fact, not evidence of any conspiracy, but a good example of how carefully this kind of heritage has to be handled. Beyond Chaco, the broader ancestral Puebloan world contains other well-documented astronomical sites. Casa Rinconada's Great Kiva, with entryways oriented towards significant solar positions. Sites at Chimney Rock in southern Colorado associated with the roughly 18.6-year lunar standstill cycle, and rock art panels across the southwest that appear to track solstice sunlight in similar ways to the Fajada Butte spiral. None of this is fringe archaeology. It's mainstream, peer-reviewed, and taught in university archaeoastronomy courses. Alongside the monumental sites, ethnographic accounts describe something more everyday and, in some ways, more remarkable. Dedicated Hopi sun-watching stations, fixed vantage points from which trained observers tracked the position of sunrise against specific landscape features across the full agricultural year. This wasn't a ceremonial curiosity performed occasionally. It functioned as an ongoing institutional responsibility, historically associated with particular clans and roles, passed down through specific family lines, and it directly determined the timing of planting, harvest, and ceremonial observances that structure Hopi communal life, including the cycle of Kachina ceremonies that mark different points in the year. None of this proves that the Blue Star prophecy describes a specific, identifiable real-world event. What it does establish on solid, mainstream, peer-reviewed evidence is that the tradition carrying that prophecy forward also carried, verifiably and for centuries, a disciplined, precise, generationally maintained relationship with the sky. Whatever the Blue Star turns out to mean, it was spoken by people whose ancestors had already demonstrated they could track celestial cycles with real accuracy. This is the section where accuracy matters most, because it's exactly where sensational retellings tend to blur real astronomy with rhetoric that sounds impressive but doesn't hold up fact. A real, dramatic supernova occurred in 1054 CE, and it is one of the best documented celestial events in pre-modern history. On July 4, 1054, court astronomers of Song Dynasty China recorded the sudden appearance of what they called a guest star near the constellation we now call Taurus, according to the surviving Chinese court records, preserved in official histories. The object was bright enough to be seen in broad daylight for roughly 23 days, and remained visible in the night sky for close to 2 years before fading from view. Independent records of a bright new star around this period also survive from Japanese and Arab astronomical traditions. In the early 20th century, astronomers realized that the expanding cloud of gas known as the Crab Nebula, when its expansion was calculated backward, pointed to an origin right around 1054, tying the historical guest star records directly to a real physical supernova remnant that we can still observe today, fact, with appropriate caution. Some rock art in the American Southwest has been proposed as a possible depiction of this event. A small number of petroglyphs and pictographs, including examples associated with Chaco Canyon and other sites in Arizona and New Mexico, show a star-like figure positioned near a crescent shape which some researchers have suggested could represent the supernova appearing close to the moon in the pre-dawn sky. An alignment that, based on calculation, would have been visible specifically from parts of western North America on the morning after the star's first recorded appearance. This remains a genuinely debated identification among archaeologists, not a settled fact. Some specialists find it a compelling match. Others note that crescent and star imagery appears in rock art for other reasons too, and caution against assuming every example depicts this specific event. Myth that the star or the prophecy was seen by all people at once in every land on the same night. This is the single biggest inaccuracy to correct, because it sounds dramatic and it simply isn't how astronomy or geography works. At any given moment, roughly half the Earth is in daylight, and the night sky isn't visible from there at all. Even among the half of the planet experiencing night, whether a specific object is visible depends on your latitude and the object's position in the sky. SN 1054 was not equally visible, or visible at all, from every point on Earth on any single night. A dramatic celestial event independently recorded by multiple, genuinely separate literate civilizations, Chinese, Japanese, Arab, is already remarkable on its own real, verifiable terms. Turning that into every person on Earth witnessed the same event on the same night upgrades a true impressive fact into a false, unfalsifiable one, and it does a disservice to how genuinely interesting the real, documented version already is. Myth that there is a hidden archive, a suppressed file, or an institutional conspiracy quietly keeping this material from public view. The far more mundane and far better supported explanation has three separate, ordinary parts. First, archaeoastronomy as an academic discipline is built around measurable, falsifiable claims, alignments that can be photographed, calculated, and independently checked. A prophecy that describes something that will happen in the future doesn't fit that methodology. A discipline built on testable claims has no built-in framework for evaluating whether a prediction is accurate, so this material tends to get filed under religious and cultural tradition rather than treated as a testable historical hypothesis, which is a limitation of the method, not evidence of suppression. Second, prophecy rock specifically hasn't been formally dated, and that's a combination of low research priority and, more importantly, the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office's ongoing, stated preference for controlled, contextual sharing of sacred material rather than open extraction and publication. Third, once Book of the Hopi became popular outside academic circles in the 1960s and 70s, it was absorbed into New Age and Ancient Mysteries frameworks that had nothing to do with what the elders actually told Waters. And that association made it professionally awkward for credentialed researchers to engage with the material seriously, for fear of appearing to endorse everything else it had been bundled with. That's a real, well-understood dynamic in how fringe adjacent material gets sidelined through association and professional caution, not through a deliberate act of concealment by any single institution. Fact with caution. Pleiades imagery does appear in Hopi ceremonial tradition and also shows up in some Hopewell-era artifacts from the Ohio Valley dating back roughly 2,000 years. The Pleiades star cluster genuinely does hold a documented, significant place in Hopi ceremonial life, connected to timing, migration, and origin narratives. That part is well established and not controversial, but it's worth being careful about how much weight to put on the Hopewell connection specifically. The Pleiades is one of the most visually striking and easily recognized objects in the entire night sky, and versions of it show up in the astronomical and mythological traditions of cultures on every inhabited continent: ancient Greece, Aboriginal Australia, West Africa, Japan, among many others. Almost certainly because it's simply one of the most noticeable things in the sky to a naked eye observer, not because every one of those cultures shares a hidden common origin. A shared interest in the Pleiades between two separate traditions is interesting and worth studying on its own terms, but it isn't by itself strong evidence of a direct historical connection between them. 60+ years after its publication, Book of the Hopi remains in print and is still cited, carefully and with its documented limitations acknowledged, in discussions of 20th century Hopi religious history. Chaco Canyon has been recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 1987, specifically because of the scale and sophistication of its architecture and astronomical alignment. Protected, studied, and visited today under active archaeological stewardship rather than left forgotten. Prophecy Rock still stands near Old Oribe, its carvings still uncatalogued by formal scientific dating, cared for and interpreted by the community whose ancestors made it. The Hopi Cultural Preservation Office continues doing what it has done for decades, engaging with researchers, journalists, and the public on terms the Hopi community sets, sharing what is appropriate to share in context, and holding back what isn't. Not because there's nothing further to tell, but because not everything that exists is owed, automatically, to an outside audience, simply because that audience is curious. That's a position increasingly respected, not just among Indigenous communities, but across museum and archaeological ethics more broadly, where the standard has shifted substantially over the last few decades toward requiring community consent before sacred material is studied, displayed, or published at all. It's also worth naming honestly that Hopi prophetic tradition has, at points over the last 60 years, been absorbed into commercial New Age publishing and ancient mysteries media in ways that strip it of context and blend it with entirely unrelated ideas. Ancient astronaut theories, doomsday predictions with specific dates attached, and so on. Responsible engagement with this material means being able to hold two things at once: taking Hopi traditions seriously as a real, documented, living body of religious thought, while also being honest that not every online retelling of it, including plenty of prior YouTube coverage, has treated it, or the people who hold it, with real care. The honest version of this story doesn't need a hidden file or a secret conspiracy to be worth telling. A community with a genuinely sophisticated, generations-deep tradition of watching and measuring the sky preserved a prophecy describing a future sign among the stars. Separately and independently, a real and spectacular supernova really did light up the daytime sky for over 3 weeks in the summer of 1054, and civilizations an ocean apart really did write it down at the time, in records that survive to this day. Whether those two threads are meaningfully connected is a real, open, and legitimately interesting question. The most accurate answer available right now is simple: we don't fully know, and part of why we don't know is that the community holding this tradition has made a deliberate ongoing choice about how much of it to share with people outside it. That's not a cover-up waiting to be exposed. That's a people protecting what's left of something the outside world has already taken a great deal from, choosing on their own terms what happens next. If you want more documentaries like this one, stories that separate what's actually documented from the myth stacked on top of it, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments which sky watching tradition from anywhere in the world